Hello and welcome. Xolo here with another vrising video, and today I'll be showing you guys 3 crypt build ideas for your vrising castle. In this video, you'll see time-lapse footage of 3 different builds. I'll be walking you guys through the building process as well as giving some of my thoughts and reasoning behind certain design decisions. I hope that by the end of the video, you guys will have the inspiration you need to build a crypt for your own castle. As always, the builds featured in this video will be downloadable for free over on my Ko-Fi for anyone interested. Alright, now let's get started. So for this first example, I started off with kind of a plus shape, and from here, I knew that I wanted double wide entrances or exits. At the time, I wasn't sure how many entrances or exits I wanted to this crypt. I was kind of imagining maybe a, kind of a middle part of a castle, maybe the bottom floor of a middle part of a castle that might have this crypt, but I wasn't really sure in my mind where I would imagine this to be exactly. I was also fiddling around with the wallpaper a bit, a little indecisive on what I wanted to go with, but I think ultimately I did end up going with the prison wallpaper as well as a crypt flooring. I kind of used 2 different kinds of crypt flooring here and played around with that a little bit. I also started placing some pillars to kind of add some visual separation in the room to kind of artificially create extra rooms on the sides. At this point, I started placing some of the servant coffins. I wasn't sure exactly how many servant coffins I wanted to add to this build, so I kind of went all over the place at first, adding as many as I could, until I realized that I couldn't place anymore, and as soon as I realized that, I was like, okay, maybe we don't need these middle coffins. I decided to go with the stone coffins for the crypt owners, I guess you could say, or the vampires of the crypt. And I just wanted to keep it kind of simple, kind of matching the walls and stuff, and I kind of decided to kind of lay them in a row next to each other rather than on different sides. At this point, I started adding some nice little fancy candles, a little bit of embellishment here and there, of course, kind of keeping a nice warm feel to this crypt. While I was building this particular crypt, I was kind of reminded of a different crypt that I walked through when I was playing Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon earlier this year. And there was like a family crypt in that one, and I will say that I did take a tiny bit of inspiration from that one, as far as like the colors and the theme and the lighting and stuff like that. I did really like the way that looked, so I said, you know what, let's make this a wonderful family crypt that is well maintained, well looked after, that kind of thing, of a prominent vampire family. And of course, you have the servants who are so lucky to be rested here as well. And of course, we have a nice little entrance kind of added there. At this point, I also removed the back entrance, and I was kind of trying to figure out what I wanted to do with carpeting or with the center. I knew I didn't want to just put a strip of carpet in the middle, so I was kind of fiddling around with different shapes, trying to figure out what felt right in the moment. But since the hallway was more of like a rectangular shape, I decided not to go with circular rugs and instead just layer rectangular ones very closely to each other. And at this point, I started adding more lighting, more warmth, then I started going into the chambers. And at this point, I was like, okay, I need to figure out what this side is going to look like before I figure out the other side, of course, because I try to do them at the same time so that I'm less likely to make mistakes while I'm building. Mistakes do happen, and of course, that's what the proof walk is for, as I like to call it on stream when I'm walking through a build that I just completed, just trying to figure out whether or not there's any issues or misplacements of items and things like that. It doesn't hurt to double check every once in a while. And of course, here I started experimenting again with the carpets, trying to figure out what shape carpets I wanted to add. I knew I wanted to keep this reddish theme to match the coffins that were in here. Unfortunately, we can't change the color of the default coffins in the game. So I had to kind of work around that a little bit so the colors wouldn't clash. But since red is my favorite color, I think we were okay with that. I didn't really have any major issues. And then, of course, I had to figure out what was going to go on the wall. Initially, for the wall, I wanted to put portraits all around, but I changed my mind and started on the sides adding curtains and other nice little trinkets and things to kind of, give it a little bit more visual variety. I ultimately also wanted to make sure that I wasn't over cluttering the walls or the room. And I did end up using different kinds of paintings and stuff. I think I ultimately went with the wooden frames on the paintings just to keep it nice and balanced with the lighting so that it wouldn't reflect too much off of the candles. And that's when I started adding in the rest of these wonderful curtains. At the end here, I really wasn't sure what kind of portraits I wanted to add. At first I was going to add the large ones, but I changed my mind, decided to go with the Castlevania ones, actually, because I really like the shape of those, and I think they just look cool. So I said, you know what, let me just add those in. I also started adding some embellishments onto the pillars, and of course cleaning things up, adding a few more wonderful candles everywhere. I think I even ended up removing the candles on the side at one point. I'm not really sure. I'd have to double check. Yep, I think I did. And then I instead changed it out for some shrubbery. I wanted to add some wonderful vases here to make sure that we had a little bit more visual variety and we didn't have too much overexposure with the lighting. So yeah, I did end up removing the candles on the sides there. And once I figured out what kind of plant I wanted and, the vase colors and all that, everything started coming together, started adding the pillar ornaments inside of the chambers, and it just looks so good. I'm very, very happy with how this build turned out. I still felt like things were not quite done yet, so I decided to add some extra little pillar ornaments on the sides or on the second half of the build. And at that point, I started thinking, okay, well, I think maybe some bat wings would be kind of cool. I rarely use them in my builds, but I thought that it looked pretty nice. And then, of course, I was messing around with chandeliers, trying to figure out the placement of them, what felt right, what felt comfortable, what felt visually correct. And I felt like the chandelier needed a little bit of an upgrade, so I ended up going with the fancier, or the fanciest chandelier we have in the game, I would argue. And I think we did all right. And of course I added a few more vases to the sides here just to kind of add a little bit more visual variety. And yeah, that was pretty much how this one came together. So yeah, I think this build for the first example came out really nicely. I think I pretty much achieved the goals that I wanted. I was able to keep a nice warm feel with the natural lighting in the room, as well as kind of complementing the reddish hues of everything else going on here. I guess I could have added maybe some carpet on the sides. I did think about it for a bit, but I kind of ultimately decided against it because I wanted the crypt flooring, the differences between the two different kinds of crypt flooring to kind of be more visually apparent and more relevant in the hallway than it was in the chambers, because the chambers are kind of naturally cut off. But overall, I think this is a really solid, warm, crypt build of, an important family. All right, so for this second example, I did something a little bit different. I decided to go with more of a royal family crypt. I thought it was really fitting to have a really tall building, kind of like a nice side piece to any castle. So if you have like a really large castle plot, this would be like the perfect kind of plot that you would want to put a shape like this onto, with a really long rectangle. On the second floor, I wasn't at first sure what to do with the pillars. I thought maybe I might add it and then keep it open, but later on I ended up deciding to add some doors for some extra flair and visual variety. At this point, I started kind of working on the overall external structures. making sure that everything was nice and even, exactly like what I wanted to work with. I tend to build the full buildings of my builds before I start decorating. I try not to decorate right away. I tend to leave that for like the last part, and I find that when I work this way, I tend to make less mistakes. I was also kind of experimenting with the flooring here. It took quite a few tries for me to decide exactly what kind of flooring I wanted for each floor. It's kind of hard to decide that at first on the fly, just knowing that I could change my mind at any moment for any arbitrary reason while building. But, you know, that's kind of the nature of decorating, I guess. And of course, at this point, I started adding in the windows, and I kind of experimented a little bit until I finally decided that I wanted to stick with the new windows we got with the Nocturnal Opulence pack DLC. And at that point, I was like, yeah, you know what? This looks kind of nice, royal. This wonderful royal looking purple is perfect. And of course, we want to have lots and lots of gold trim. Lots of gold accents throughout the entire build. At this point, I started inspecting my work from the outside. Wanted to make sure I didn't miss anything. And on the second floor, I started kind of continuing that, making sure I didn't miss anything. It can be a little tricky in builds like this, where you have a lot of repetition, because sometimes you'll make like tiny little mistakes, or you'll find yourself putting like the wrong color in places without even realizing it. I kind of toyed around with the kind of coffins I wanted on the third floor, but I wasn't really sure what I wanted just yet. On the second floor, I also made the coffins kind of match the windows. And at this point, I was kind of having a good feel for the spacing. I wasn't entirely sure what I wanted to do. And of course, I swapped out the coffin there at the last minute. Now, messing around with carpets in a room that large without knowing what kind of furniture you're going to have down is definitely a mistake. I should have never messed around with a carpet before placing all of the furniture items first. That was something that I kind of regret in hindsight, to be honest. And of course, I didn't know how many of these coffins I wanted on this floor, mostly because I didn't even figure out how many of these coffins I wanted on the first floor, let alone the third floor. But over time, I started messing around with the shapes of the carpets, the shape of the room, the layout of the coffins, how many coffins. Like, I just had to make sure that whatever I did, it felt just right. And ultimately, I figured I'd put, you know what, maybe 3 coffins at the top rather than just having one single lonely coffin. And at this point, I started rewriting the carpet because I realized I had made a horrible mistake. And of course, at the top, I kind of looped it around, make it a little bit more visually interesting. Then I decided to go back downstairs, kind of mess around with that again. I started rearranging the pillars because I ultimately did not really like the way that some of the pillars looked from the second floor. And I, you know, felt like it was a little bit inconsistent. So I went back, redid some of the pillaring. Added a little bit more, and I know this time lapse is a little fast, guys. This was the longest build by far, so you guys are watching this at like I think like 1000 speed or something crazy like that. 1000% speed, I mean, but that's okay. We're gonna also add in some wonderful lights here. This is when, you know, a lot of it started coming together in my mind, and I was like, all right, I think I know the design I want to go with. Especially on the first floor. I really like how this carpet looks against this particular flooring. This is the Castlevania flooring, I believe. So, of course, you know, that's another DLC pack, but I really enjoyed it. It really has a wonderful royal feel, and I just love the way that the coffins look against that flooring. It looked just so good. And of course, at this point, I started adding a lot of the lighting to the pillars, a lot of the lighting in general, just to make sure that everything was lining up. And of course, I started adding chandeliers to the second floor rather than the first floor, so that there'd be some lighting below, but not too much lighting, because I knew I had a lot of candles and stuff that I was kind of placing on the first floor. I also started adding some pews kind of randomly throughout for anyone who maybe wanted to kind of sit there and, you know, have some thoughts about their loved ones or whatever. I didn't really have a good inspiration for that, I'm gonna be honest. I just kind of threw them in there because I thought it looked okay. And of course, I had some family portrait kind of stuff going on here. I messed around with the framings, decided to go with the gold accent framings. And then I added in these high back chairs so that there was some proper seating in the chamber, which I thought was really cool. And in the back here, I started adding some more photos. And on the second floor, this is when I started reducing the number of pillars on the second floor. I thought it was a little excessive. I went back upstairs, and this is when the chaos began, because this is when I started saying, you know what, maybe I don't want serving coffins in here. Maybe I just want full-on family coffins. You know, usually royal families, they'll have like lots of family members from like decades past and things like that. So I said, you know what, maybe they should all be royal family coffins. And that's when I started adding the lamps. This is when I feel like the build was really starting to kind of reach that nice kind of inspiration. I started messing around with the kinds of plants in the vases, and ultimately went with the lavender. The lavender definitely has like a lot of the nice kind of looks, and of course it's the only purple plant. So I said, you know what, let's do that. I realized there I made a mistake, never made a window on that wall. Fix that. And then at this point I started trying to decide what kind of curtains I wanted. Ultimately went with the gold accent curtains. And of course in the centerpieces here, I don't like to leave the center too empty, so I started adding in some lights. It was a little excessive, but I didn't know exactly what else I wanted to put. So at that point I started messing around with the walls, kind of said, you know what, I'll come back to the center, and made sure that all my candles were up. This is when I went to the second floor, adding more lamp lights, making sure that everything was well spaced, added some carpet so that there's a little bit more visual variety with a different kind of carpet than I used downstairs. And of course this flooring is different as well. And I started adding my vases, adding the lavender to the vases, kind of going back, making sure that all of the lighting was nice and even throughout the second floor. And of course I started messing around with the pillar banners and stuff. Didn't really know I wanted to do there, but ultimately I did decide to add some banners. And then on the insides, instead of adding more banners, I ended up overwriting them with some nice bat wings, if I remember correctly. And you'll see that in a bit. Just kind of cleaning up, making sure I had enough of the lamps everywhere. And this is when I started really having fun with these little light stands. Adding the nice little purple light stands to the side, just to kind of, you know, add a nice little trim around the sides. And I think honestly, it just made the second floor look so much cooler. And this is when I started adding the bat wings on the insides of the squares to kind of emphasize, you know, the focal point, which is near the chandeliers in the center. Then I went back to the third floor, started messing around with this again. I wasn't sure exactly about the lighting, and then I said, you know what, maybe add some pillar mounted lights to match in. It'll look really nice. Really cool embellishments. And of course that little room was more like an embalming room, I guess. Not sure why you would need that for a vampire crypt, but it looked cool, so I added it in anyway. Wasn't really sure what to do with that space, so I said, why not? This is when I started messing around with the statues. I really like these directional statues. I wasn't really sure how to place them, how many to place. You know, you want to kind of be careful when you're adding a bunch of statues in a row like this. You don't want to overdo it, but at the same time, if you're going to commit to an idea, you want to make sure that the idea is whole. So I ultimately kind of messed around with the different statues, added some of the male statues that were more symmetrical, and then I also started messing around adding some more plants. This is when I went back into that tiny room and was kind of like, you know, let me add a little table in here in case someone wants to work with stuff for some reason. And then we went back to the first floor. I started removing some of these lamps because at this point I knew I wanted some couches. I wanted some seating area, add a little bit of visual variety. I was kind of deciding between the two different nocturnal opulence couches, and I ended up going with the simpler one in the center. And then of course I didn't like that there was no shrubbery like in the middle there, so I ultimately started adding some corrupted flowers to kind of add a nice embellishment to it on the fronts and back. And of course you can see it all kind of grow in nicely. And I did use the weeping willow backing for the trellises to make sure that they had a little bit of nice visual variety. And of course I used the purple ones so that we're kind of staying on theme here with the nice royal purple. I guess in hindsight I could have gone with a white there, I think if I went with a white, it might have possibly stood out a little bit more, but there weren't any lights that are like super close to it, so I was kind of like, maybe I'll leave it alone. So I was a little bit on the fence there, but I did ultimately stick with the purple. I decided to just kind of not mess up there with the theme. And of course, I really liked that idea downstairs, started adding it upstairs in this nice little coffin area. And I'm really happy with how this build turned out. I think it definitely looks like a royal family crypt. Now that I'm in post-production, taking a look at some of these finished photos, I am really, really happy with how it turned out. I mean, it just looks so nice. It's very lavish. The purple is just, I mean, it just pops so much. I think using the corrupted flowers was the right call for this build, as well as the lavender. It just has a really nice, like, royal feel to it. I mean, you go in there and you know that the people who rest there are important. You know, you get that vibe immediately just looking around and seeing the lighting and the embellishments and stuff like that. I guess I could have also potentially used a fancier brazier potentially, but I honestly think that just using the vampire ones worked out nicely for this build. So yeah, pretty nice. All right, so for this third and final build, this one is more like a basement style crypt. I used an elevated part of the plot to basically kind of lead into this particular crypt. So it's kind of like like I said earlier, more like a basement kind of crypt. Even though we don't really have basements in this game, I figured it kind of, you know, simulated that because of the height difference. And I made sure that there was no other way to kind of enter this space without that. I decided to go with a more traditional style crypt where the coffins will face the wall, or kind of, well, not be facing the wall per se, but like kind of be laying horizontally against the wall, kind of like parallel, I guess is the word I'm trying to look for here. I experimented with different kinds of flooring at first, but I wanted to do something that was kind of stony, you know, kind of just rough textured stone, or something that is not too nice looking. Now you're probably wondering why, right? Well, for this build, I wanted to go with something completely different from the first and second build. I wanted to go for something that looked a little bit more abandoned, a little less upkept, a little more rough, dusty, something that was still interesting and good to look at, but that clearly had been neglected at one point or another. Or, well, currently, or that's the vibe I was trying to go for. Again, I was kind of messing around with the floor types again. I also, I noticed later on, right after I finished decorating this, that I had actually flipped one of the coffins in the wrong direction in the center. But I do end up correcting that before the photo shoot, so don't worry guys, I caught the mistake, we're good. At this point, you can see me messing around with different kinds of rugs. I decided to kind of mess around with these like kind of tattered rugs, and I've never really used them in a build before, but I figured they kind of fit into this theme a lot better than pretty much anything else I could have used. And of course, I also ended up switching over to the black version of that same rug. I wanted it to kind of contrast against the floor a little bit more, because I knew I was going to add a bunch of other types of decorative things. At this point, I was trying to decide whether I wanted some kind of caging to the you know, coffins, whether or not I wanted each part of the, you know, coffins to be kind of separated from the main area, or if I wanted it to have a lock or not, and things like that. So, you know, I did that. I also started adding some curtains, you know, some raggedy old curtains that look like they're about to fall apart any minute now. And of course, I was kind of experimenting a little bit with flowers, but I think I ultimately decided not to go with any of the vases, because I felt like they were a little bit too fancy for this kind of build. And I started messing around with the stone gargoyles on the pillars. And I absolutely love these little gargoyles. They're so cute. And of course, I also started adding in, you know, different varieties of them. I wanted to have a nice mixture, and I do end up changing it a little bit throughout the build here and there and making adjustments, but I feel like that's kind of a natural thing you end up having to do. I thought about adding some busts into the crypts, but ultimately I just kind of didn't really like it. I mean, I don't think I've ever used a bust in a build. in any of my builds, really. There's really not a lot of variety on the types of bust. There's only like a male-female version. They don't really have like different hairstyles or anything like that too much, so it's kind of bleh. So I decided not to go with it. I did add some spooky lighting though. I wanted to choose something that was a little bit spectral looking, you know, the kind of unnatural lighting that you would see in some place that's maybe possibly haunted. And at this point I also thought, well, let's add some more gargoyles. We have plenty. We need to protect this place with the power of gargoyles. I love these little statues. And then of course I started adding some mourning lilies because we are in mourning. These people are dead. And maybe the mourning lilies are also there to remind us that no one's upkeeping the place, which is also really sad. So decided to add that in, add some benches, kind of keep things looking a little similar. I try not to do symmetrical builds without completing one side entirely first, but I kind of broke my rule here because I really wasn't sure what I wanted to do with the benches, and I was a little unfamiliar with the spacing because of the type of carpet or rug I was using. So I wanted to make sure that it wasn't going to be like kind of weird. I tried experimenting with some candle stands here, ended up going with a brazier, with a really modest brazier, I think is what it's called here. And then of course I started making adjustments with the lighting, adjusting the chairs, adding another brazier. I also went around kind of looking and comparing back and forth, and of course I did eventually grow out those flowers, but I was just making sure that the lighting was balanced and not kind of like too overwhelming for either side of the build, because I didn't want it to look a little too crazy. The hardest part, I think, of this build was definitely the entrance area. At first, I thought about adding just a bunch of mourning lilies, and then I kind of changed my mind. Decided to go with some sitting benches, had to make a ton of adjustments on the benches and the flower pots just to make sure that they weren't like weird or anything. You know, wanted to make sure they're all looking good. And I grew them in so that they would all be facing outward from the chairs in an equal way. And I almost put another potting plant thing there, but I changed my mind and went with a gargoyle. And of course daytime happened. I continued my build, and I decided to add some kind of like obsidian looking statues. In hindsight, maybe I should have gone with the stone, but I didn't want to oversaturate with stone, especially when I have stone seating there. So I just want a little bit more visual variety, especially because I used some dark rugs and draperies. And at this point I started covering the entire crypt with a bunch of draperies, nothing too fancy obviously. And then of course I also added some pillar ornaments, some nice banners to kind of mix and match with it. And this is when stuff started getting a little bit tedious. I had to make sure I didn't miss any spots here with this cobwebbing. You can actually get this cobwebbing from the free DLC pack. I think it's called like Hollowed Knights pack or something like that. It usually comes out once a year around Halloween, so if you don't have this pack, don't worry. You can definitely get it probably next year around October. So yeah, keep an eye out for that. It's, you know, free. They also have it on the PS5 version of the game as well, so if you're over on PS5, no worries, they did add it there as well. And of course I was kind of messing around here. At this point I was like, okay, I'm not happy with the flooring. I started experimenting with the different tiles until something felt right. And eventually I kind of settled on this like stone, but I decided to use kind of like the dark green texture or color for that stone, for the outdoor stone. And I just put it right inside. I was kind of debating putting it in the hallway and ultimately just decided not to. Decided to keep it clean even though it wasn't, you know, totally fitting the vibe I wanted, but I think that I was pretty happy with it by the time this was over. And of course we have our finishing photos here, and honestly guys, I think that this build was absolutely fantastic. I definitely I think hit the nail on the head as far as the thematic you know, thing I was kind of going for here. You know, spooky, creepy vibes, you know, unkept but still kind of there. I mean, the gargoyles with the wonderful looking flowers there, I mean, just absolutely gorgeous. And, you know, not all things that look pretty in my eyes have to be like, you know, super royal looking, of course. This was a very abandoned looking crypt. And of course, you know, with lots of really, really nice things here without too much furniture, not too much embellishment. Very simple build to replicate. So, what did you think of these builds? Did you find this video helpful? Let me know in the comments below. A while back, I made a similar series of videos, but with Castle Thrones, so I'll be leaving a link to that here in case you might want to check that out as well. If you like this video, please leave a like, share, and subscribe for more vrising content. Anyway, I hope you have a wonderful day, and as always, Xolo out.